Good evening, everybody, and thank you all very much for coming to this lecture. And of course, welcome Professor Quinn Slobodian. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. If you currently follow the news, especially when it comes to inequality or climate change, there's often talk about how we want the economy to work. And since the COVID-19 pandemic, this talk about the economy has intensified. And of course, it's been a topic of the election campaigns in the United States. Will probably also be a topic in the upcoming elections here in Germany. One word that is hard to escape in these debates is neoliberalism. And since neoliberalism is, in a sense, a fuzzy term, we could think of no better guest to invite than Professor Quinn Slobodian, Associate Professor of History at Wellesley College in the United States, to give us an understanding of what neoliberalism actually means and how economic globalism has developed. His last self-authored book is, of course, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism. You might have read the German translation from Surkamp, and most recently in 2020, he published 9 Lives of Neoliberalism, which he co-edited with Dieter Plehwe and Philip Mirowski. Professor Slobodian was also a postdoc fellow at Freie Universität Berlin. As a visiting scholar, he was at Harvard University, the University of Bologna, and the University of Frankfurt. In 2017-18, he was again at Harvard University as an ACLS Frederick Burkhardt residential fellow. And also important to mention, in addition to his numerous scholarly publications, Quinn Slobodian writes regularly for The Guardian, The New York Times, and Foreign Policy. Again, thank you very much, Quinn, for accepting our invitation. We look forward to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much to Jakob and Franziska and Michaela for making this happen. And I'm looking forward to what you all have to say in response to the talk. I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and it should leave us a good chunk of time to discuss afterwards, and I'm happy to take it then in any direction people find interesting. The way I kind of set up my remarks today is to sort of take us on a bit of a journey from the past of economic globalism into the present, and then some speculations about the future. And to sort of help us on our way, I've used some key terms that will, I think, help guide us in our discussion, which I'll share with you here on the PowerPoint. So for the past mode of globalism, I want to kind of organize my remarks around these categories, some familiar, some less familiar, of Imperium and dominium, the idea of xenos rights, and the idea of catalaxy and encasement. If these are not already familiar to you, that's fine. They're not necessarily household terms, but I will sort of use them to help explain what I think some of the goals and kind of aspirations of a certain version of globalism, that is a project of organizing the world economy as a whole, has been up until recently. Then we'll talk about the present through a much more digestible trio of terms: China, chips, and carbon. And then say something about the future through the categories of territory, triage, and the Greek category of the feet. So let's begin, though, with the past. Here I can sort of return a bit to some of the themes of the book that Jakob was kind enough to mention, which I'll also mention was recently published by the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung at a very, very cheap price, about the price of a mini pizza or whatever, depending on your preference. And it's available online. But in that book Globalists, I gave a kind of a stylized account of the 20th century. So it's a very partial, in a way, kind of a strange version of 20th century history, but it's one that makes sense because of the actors that I choose to kind of follow the century through. In the eyes of the neoliberal intellectuals that I use in that book, the 20th century was different than the way it's usually thought about. So the 20th century was for them not about the kind of clash between big ideologies of fascism and communism and liberalism, nor was it a kind of a period defined by two big wars at the beginning and then a long Cold War right up to the end. For them, the 20th century was actually about two movements, two developments that were held in tension and that ended up producing sort of the central dilemma of global economic governance. So what were those two developments? They were, on the one hand, the way that over the 20th century, we saw a kind of ever greater global economic interdependence across all metrics, volume of trade, so people are trading more over borders, people are moving more over borders, more money is traveling over borders. We're getting, in short, the emergence of a single world economy, right? So this is one of the things that people see happening in the course of the 20th century. However, at the same time, it seems like something very different is also happening, right? Because politically, we're getting ever more fragmentation, ever more multiplication of polities, new states, new nations, empires break up. The kind of checkerboard of the world's surface gets shattered ever more into smaller and smaller pieces of self-government and self-determination. So this becomes the sort of the basic problem of the 20th century to neoliberals, and really of the 21st century too, which is how can you balance a world of ever greater political fragmentation and splintering with a reality of ever deeper economic integration. So when did these moments of kind of fragmentation kind of accelerate? We can get a sense of this by looking back at the screen. You can see here a kind of 20th century map or a timeline of new sovereign states, so moments when new states were created. You can see here, right, basically three spikes. The first spike right after the First World War, so the breakup of the territorial empires of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the creation of new states like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and so on. The second you can see in the 1960s is the end of overseas European empires. So when you say the word decolonization, usually you're thinking about this period, 1960s, early 70s, when Asian and African colonies gained their independence. And then thirdly, though, when we sort of think about less along these lines, the end of the Cold War and the breakup of Yugoslavia, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the emergence of many new independent nation states. So I talk about these as kind of like the three great secessions of the 20th century. So they're moments that sort of pose that problem that I've described, that problem of the tension between a single world economy and a world of hundreds of nation states. Those become especially pointed problems in these moments of breakup, of crack-up. The neoliberals, one of the things that's nice about them is they sort of introduce some different terms for us to think about this problem. So one of the terms that they're fond of is this sort of binary that comes from Roman law, is also then used by Immanuel Kant, and then was discussed deeply by Carl Schmitt, and that is the division that I put on the first slide between Imperium and dominium. So Imperium is the world of sovereignty and the world of states. Dominium is the world of ownership and the world of property. The challenge, once again, is another way of restating the problem of a one world economy in a world of hundreds of nation states. How do you balance a world where some people think that sovereignty should mean ownership, when others want to make sure that ownership, that is property, can always trump national sovereignty, right? So how can you create a world where property is universal? If you sit in Würzburg or London, you can be assured that your investment in Singapore or Sao Paulo is safe, regardless of what the government of Singapore chooses, regardless of what the people of Brazil choose. This is the problem of balancing sort of imperium and dominium. This becomes an ongoing issue across the 20th century, right? Because when those countries gain independence, when you become a sovereign nation state, one of the things it's natural to think is that you now have the ability to do with the objects on your territory what you as a polity would like, what you democratically agree is just or fair or fitting or desirable. So these three moments after the First World War, 1960s, 1990s, are kind of these pressure points where neoliberals saw increased push by populations to overrule the right of property, to overrule the right of ownership, and to take control, basically, of things that were on their property, their territory, that did not, that belonged to foreigners. So this, you could go into many examples of this from all of these three moments. After the First World War, there was much nationalization and the seizure of property owned by foreigners. In the 1960s, there was a big push for poorer nations in Latin America and Africa to take over foreign-owned enterprises. So let's say foreign-owned mines, foreign-owned harbors. The Suez Canal is a wonderful example of this in 1956. The challenge there for neoliberals is how to make sure that these post-colonial, whether you're talking about Czechoslovakia, Egypt, or in some ways, Lithuania, these post-colonial, post-imperial nations, how can they be made sure not to overstep the boundaries of property rights that, as they felt, had to be global? So this is the riddle of globalism for neoliberals, is how can you construct an arrangement so that the world of dominium will not be infringed on by the world of imperium. One of the things that they talk about, and that I included on that first slide, is this idea of xenos rights. Now, the category of xenos, you might know that from like xenophobia, for example, right? Often understood as just meaning the other, but in Greek itself, it means something slightly different. It's sort of the category of the so-called guest friend. So it's the foreigner, but it's the foreigner who is on your native territory. Therefore, the foreigner needs to be treated as someone who is both a guest and someone who is not of the space within which they're currently inhabiting. And Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, talked about xenos and the xenoi because he thought that when you design order, when you design institutions, you in a way are less concerned with the rights of the citizen, more concerned with the rights of the xenos. Why? Because the xenos is the investor, the xenos is the trader, the xenos is the entrepreneur, the xenos is the businessman. They're the ones who are bringing their capital into your country, bringing their goods into your country. And so you need a legal arrangement to make sure that their rights are treated equally with those of citizens. And if you study international economic law and international investment law, you'll find that this is kind of what it's all about. It's an attempt to create laws such that foreigners get what is often called national treatment. In other words, they're treated as if they were citizens or residents of the place within which they are bringing their money or making their contracts. So if you want to think about a legal vision for governing the globe as a single economic space, it's helpful to think about this, that it's about securing rights for xenoi rather than actually rights for citizens. The foreigner, in some ways, is more important than the native in that sense. So the three moments that I named there are also moments where we can see sort of attempts by often business advocacy groups and international organizations. They tried to come up with new legal arrangements to kind of embed or make immovable and unchallengeable these international property rights, and to make the xenos rights something that can be appealed to and something that will be defended by courts and states and so on. And in my book, in the Globalist book, I kind of follow these different attempts, these different experiments in defending global property rights specifically. So after the First World War, of course, the League of Nations is kind of the first attempt at a properly international organization. And for a while, some of the neoliberals I write about, who had mostly come from Austria or Germany and in exile, often were gathering in Geneva. This was true for Wilhelm Röpke, this was true for Ludwig von Mises. They were there next to the League of Nations effectively, and we're hoping that the League of Nations could provide one solution to this, could secure investor rights over borders, and among other things, they wrote there the first draft investment codes of the kind that I just described exist in the thousands now. The bilateral investment treaties, which are so common now as part of cross-border trade, were kind of pioneered in the 1920s and 30s at the League of Nations, only to be revived much later. But as you know, if you've studied any of this at all, the League of Nations was not powerful because the United States itself did not sign up. And very quickly, the fascist war machine overwhelms any kind of power it had to sort of propose an alternative order for Europe. After the Second World War, however, of course, the United Nations became another attempt to revive a more muscular version, you could say, of the League of Nations. But from the eyes of the neoliberals, the United Nations made a mistake because they kind of gave too much power to Imperium and didn't respect the sanctity of dominium enough. So there was too much of acceptance of the importance of political rights and not enough defense of capital rights. A case in point here is the fact that the United Nations General Assembly, in their minds, kind of replicated one person, one vote democracy by giving one country one vote. As more and more countries decolonized and entered the United Nations General Assembly, the neoliberals became very concerned that there was a majority of poorer nations, there was a majority of African, Asian, and Latin American nations, there was a majority of non-white nations, as they were often quite open to racialize their fears of disorder. Therefore, the United Nations for them was also something that they were not that hopeful of as a kind of as a kind of guardian for the world economy. It wasn't really until the 1990s and the creation of the World Trade Organization that you got something that neoliberals finally felt like was cut to the measure of their vision of defending global property rights. Why the World Trade Organization? Because the World Trade Organization, although it adhered to a kind of a model of one country, one vote, nonetheless had a policy of having one law for the world economy. So developing countries, poorer countries didn't get a kind of exceptional status, which they had in many other arrangements before. And there was a kind of a tool for enforcement. So if you didn't follow the judgments of the World Trade Organization, then there was a procedure by which you could have so-called retaliatory tariffs put on you, so your trade could become more expensive for other nations. So this seemed like finally for neoliberals and people working in the tradition, especially of someone like Friedrich Hayek, was a way to create a kind of a global policeman for international trade that could prioritize the rights of investors over borders. It could prioritize the absolute principle of free trade. It could prioritize the liberal movement of capital across borders as being something that was very close to a human right. In fact, the language that many of these authors used in the 1990s was to say the right to trade, the right to take money over borders is a human right, and it should be included actually in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And this was something they actually tried to do from the 1940s to the 1990s. One of the things that I do in the book that I think it does distinguish it from previous works on neoliberalism is I move very strongly away from a description of the last 40 years of economic globalization as one of the liberation of markets, or even the disembedding of markets, or this idea of unfettered trade or unfettered finance. So these are terms that one often hears even amongst critical and leftist authors to describe economic globalization. One of the points I really bring home, I think, strongly in the book is that this is a misleading way to look at globalization, that actually we should think of not about liberation of markets, but what I call encasement of markets. And the category used in the German translation is Ummantelung. So in other words, the world of free trade, such as it is, the world of free movements of assets over borders is not one that happens in a vacuum or an absence of laws in a way that it's liberated, but it happens exactly through the proliferation and the multiplication of new kinds of law and new kinds of legal arrangements, whether those are investment treaties, the creation of trusts, and all ways of shielding assets from taxation or from oversight or appropriation by the government. We're actually in an era of sort of hyper-legalization rather than an era of freedom and disembeddedness. So if anything, I think that one should come away from my book with, or my understanding of economic globalism as it developed in the 20th century, is it was a project of lawmaking and legalization. So there's lots to study there. You don't just need to parse the idea of neoliberal freedom. You can just go out and start studying, as people do and have done, you know, the laws that are used for dispossession, the laws that are used, you know, from Palestine to Western Canada, the laws that are used to shield corporations from lawsuits, the laws that are used to allow, let's say, corporations to sue governments for profits that they have lost because of changes in regulation overseas where they were investing. So there's a million things to study there. And I think that one of the things that is productive about this approach is it brings the neoliberal vision sort of down to earth. And it says it isn't just a fuzzy idea of being an entrepreneur of yourself or just commodifying every last minute of the day. It's just actually just a ton of legal machinery, and we can become kind of engineers of that machinery as critics, just as the people who profit from it are engineers of it through the way that they can exploit its advantages for themselves and for their clients. So that is, I mean, that's sort of the past of economic globalism as I see it, which is that the goal for the 20th century, which was partially achieved by the year 2000, was to say that the world economy is a kind of autonomous sphere that needs to be protected from the incursion of democratic interference. And politically, governments only have limited tools to actually affect economic forces. And you can see this if you look in the discourse of Tony Blair, Gerhard Schröder, Bill Clinton in the late 1990s. Just go look at their speeches. Every 5 minutes, they're blaming globalization and saying that they can't do anything about it, right? It's the storms of globalization. to try to stop it is like, pushing against the seasons. It's like pushing against the changing of the tides. These things are just inevitable and they're natural. So in a way, that was the great sort of political and ideological success of globalism in the 20th century, was to make us think that, that the international division of labor and the inequalities that resulted from it were simply natural and inevitable and could not be resisted or changed through policies. Which brings us to globalism present. So I actually think that this has changed recently. And how has it changed? And what are signs of it having changed? Here, I think it's worth thinking about these three categories just very schematically, just as kind of handholds in a hugely complex landscape. But if we think about these categories, China, chips, and carbon, then how can we perceive a kind of deep transformation in the economic assumptions and the logic that govern policymaking, especially in the Western world right now? To start with the first, China. It's impossible to think about the present change in political and economic discussions without seeing this as a result of the extremely rapid rise to economic dominance of China since the year 2001, when they entered the WTO. I don't have the graphs here, but if I did have them, they would all go like this. Ratio of global steel production, ratio of global manufacturing, ratio of everything from in spheres of textiles to electronics and so on. The challenge that was presented by China was one significant at the broadest level, because it undermined the way that American interest was coinciding with the language of global interest. So when the World Trade Organization was created in 1995, the United States was the undisputed economic superpower, and they could say easily that what is good for the world is good for America, because they had such an advantage in manufacturing, they had such an advantage in the high value sectors, that it was true that any opening of trade would actually just accrue more and more profits to parts of the American economy. Since the rise of the Chinese challenge in the early 2000s, that's no longer true. And as we've seen now, there's been a hard pivot in the economic language of the United States now, where they no longer speak in terms of universalism. They no longer speak in terms of the need for global free trade as an absolute value. Instead, the new kind of lodestar, the North Star that they orient to, is the containment of Chinese economic power. That has been an issue for American presidents since Obama, at least. But Obama was still, I would argue, under the kind of shadow of this 1990s style neoliberal ideology, so much that he couldn't actually break with the idea of naturalized globalization. He couldn't come right out and say, we can depart from free trade. It isn't always an absolute good. It has done harm to parts of the American population. He couldn't say those words. Neither could anyone else. Neither could any of the Republicans. It actually did take, a bore and, in a way, a useful idiot of history, Donald Trump, to say some of the things that no one else actually had the kind of ability to say. So when he came on the scene in 2016, he basically picked up talking points from Bernie Sanders, who was making intelligent criticisms of globalization, and then used them for his own campaign, and started saying, globalization has done wrong to America. China is sucking the life out of the American Midwest. It's destroying American manufacturing. And these were all things that had been taboo until that point to say publicly as a political figure, but he went ahead and said them. And more than that, when he came to office, he actually started a very substantial trade war of the kinds that America had not done since the 1930s with China, putting on steel aluminum tariffs, not just against China, but also against Europe, against Canada, in ways that if you go back and read the financial press, everyone just assumed this was going to basically destroy the world economy, right? I mean, even someone like Joseph Stiglitz, who is a critic of globalization, go back to January 2017, and what is he saying? If Trump puts on these tariffs, then we are going to see, a global recession. There's going to be a huge backlash from voters, and it will be a disaster. And it was none of those things. It didn't change the global economic state of things, really. Voters didn't care. In fact, many of them seem to have actually appreciated it. And it didn't actually change the price of goods that much. It affected specific sectors, of course. But what this did was it kind of broke the curse, the kind of knocks that had hung over the head of policymakers for 30 years. And it said that, okay, now you can do things with tariffs. Free trade is not an absolute value. And when you see now the transition from Trump to Biden, what has changed in their attitude towards China from an economic point of view? Nothing has changed. They have the same policy. Not just that, but who else has come on board? Canada has come on board. The EU has come on board. So the new normal for globalism is one that isn't globalism, because it is specifically designed in containing one part of the world economic landscape, China, and preserving the existing and remaining economic power of a new transatlantic bloc that includes the EU, UK, US, Canada, Mexico in some sort of arrangement. And you can see this very clearly if you look at, for example, the new NAFTA arrangement, which is called the USMCA. And one of the important parts of the new treaty is that if Canada or Mexico makes a side deal with China, the whole treaty is canceled. So it's designed not just to integrate North America, but explicitly to contain China. The EU is kind of playing an interesting game here in that they tried to create a comprehensive investment treaty with China before Biden was inaugurated. But then since, because of the blow up over Xinjiang, this treaty is on ice, as they say. It doesn't look like it's would actually pass through European Parliament. So the EU first seemed like it might be trying to play both sides, a little bit of China here, a little bit of US there. But now it looks like they're being more firmly cemented into the transatlantic bloc. Which brings us to this next point, which is that of chips. So this was already happening before COVID, but COVID has obviously accelerated it. But the skepticism about global supply chains is something that is new and now become common sense very quickly. So the idea that you shouldn't just build things and make things wherever it's cheapest to build them, but you should think about so-called supply chain resilience and what things you might need in the case of exogenous shocks, like say global pandemics or also wars. This is now something that policymakers are talking about in a way they have not talked about for 25 years. So and you can see this with the supply chain review that Biden started as soon as he came into office, which is he said, we're going to look at 3 things, and we're going to make sure that we have our own access to them that isn't compromised by China, specifically pharmaceuticals, chips or semiconductors, and critical materials for green energy supply. So things like lithium, things like cobalt, things that go into batteries. Right now, India is trying to create its own semiconductor, its own chip capacity. EU is making its own chips. The United States is making their own chips. Previous to this, they all came from Taiwan and China. And no one thought that was a problem. Now, everyone thinks it's a problem. Everyone thinks that for the needs of a digitized economy, and one that might be facing future epidemics, and one that brings us to carbon, is undergoing a very urgent process of energy transition. You need to have access to all of these raw materials and production capacity somewhere with either an ally or on your own territory. Totally different changed circumstances from the 1990s. So in that sense, it isn't a globalist arrangement, right? It is one that is, and this brings me to my third point, it signals a return of the attention to territory in a way that we have not been thinking about for a very long time. So this takes us to our vision of what the future might hold. I have here territory, triage, and the idea of the thief. For a long time, the way that people talked about globalization was they often used this category from really from Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, which is the category of deterritorialization. And it was never really true, right? It's never really true that economies are deterritorialized. Even the cloud that we store our files in, of course, sits in real data centers and requires energy supplies. And we know this, right? It's kind of obvious in a way. But policymakers from 1995 until 2016 did kind of act as if they were beyond territory. And now nobody does. Everyone is highly attentive to the question of territory, the idea that critical inputs for, as I was saying, important manufacturers need to be either close at hand or being manufactured by very, very close allies. And that's something that could have different political outcomes, right? I mean, I think that one of the assumptions when it comes especially to the question of carbon and climate is that if we take climate seriously and carbon seriously, then we must be cooperating more at a global level, right? That serious attention to climate change and carbon and decarbonization naturally has a globalizing impulse. I don't think that's true at all, right? I mean, I think that the way that we reacted to COVID is a good test run for some of the ways we might react to accelerated climate catastrophe, which is a kind of every person for themselves, every nation for themselves. There's a kind of a pulling up of the drawbridge. The very act of bringing the supply chains home is explicitly about disadvantaging those who are further down the socioeconomic ladder, right? And one can see this very clearly with access to vaccines, right? Where on the one hand, yes, we are all in it together, one world of COVID and the epidemic. On the other hand, are even these supposedly now enlightened left liberal governments making any consideration really of offering the same number of vaccines to poorer countries as they are to their own citizens? Not at all. So you can be simultaneously, attentive to something that is a globalizing problem while also having a remedy that is deeply fragmentary and actually deglobalizing in the sense that it reinforces territorial boundaries and boundaries of community. One of the ways to think about that hierarchy of human lives is through the category of triage, which I put up there on the screen. This has been bouncing around for a little while with people discussing the idea of triage. If you're probably familiar with it, but it's the process of sort of sorting out who needs to be attended to most quickly under conditions of an emergency or an accident. So if there's an earthquake, there's a big fire, medical teams show up and they immediately start sorting out the people on the ground according to how bad their condition is. And you actually put tags on them. So you put a green tag on them if they're actually fine and they can walk around. You put a red tag on them if they need to be attended to right away. And you put a black tag on them if they're actually dead and it's too late. I've written about a bit, and I think it's true that we can see this logic of triage kind of being applied globally through the creation of green zones and red zones. And I think that the dynamic of triage is something that will inevitably intensify as these challenges, especially of of climate catastrophe and the likely future pandemics, right, continue to unfold. The category of feet then that I include at the end is a way of kind of making that a slightly more concrete. The term comes from the lowest category of servant in the Athenian city-state, but I am interested in its use by the science fiction author Neil Stephenson, and he talks about feet as a kind of person who has no affiliation, and that is, they have no affiliation either to a political entity or, in his world, which is set in this light future, to a kind of a franchise state or a privatized entity. So in his world, you have nation states, but then you also have things like gated communities where everyone just pays to get in and signs a contract, and they're not really citizens, they're affiliates, and they belong to this private service providing organization. Thetes are those people who don't belong to either. They have neither no nation nor kind of a membership in a franchise state. Given the kind of continuing fragmentation of the provision of services, the ongoing privatization of publicly held land in Europe, the United Kingdom, and the United States, not to mention places beyond Brazil, South America, South Africa, and so on. I think that this is one way to sort of think about where we might end up after globalism, so to speak, that if we get to an actually a fragmented landscape without the centralizing instance of something like the World Trade Organization or the EU or the United Nations, and it is a kind of a checkerboard of polities within which services are both privately offered and publicly offered, and there is the possibility of being truly, beyond either, then I think that the world after neoliberal globalism, so to speak, could quite easily be something that's even worse than the one that we've had so far. So I think on that optimistic note, I might just finish off. I'm happy to talk about anything here or things that you would have preferred I talk about, and instead of what I talked about, anything you like. Happy to chat after this now.